Okay, good morning, everybody. It's about that time to get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us again for another installment of our COVID series of webinars that we bring to everybody each Wednesday. So again, thank you for setting aside some time to sit with us this morning to go through a packed agenda that we have for you today. So lots to talk about today, as I mentioned, so we can just get right into it. Again, I'm Jason Flynn, the Director of Human Resources and Client Services for Prestige PEO. Along for the ride today, of course, is Andrew Lubash, founder and principal of Prestige PEO, as well as our trusted partner, Seth Peretta from the Groom Law Group. It's nice to have both of you again here with us today. And joining us for the first time today is the Chief Operating Officer of Prestige PEO, Eric Fudum. I'm sure many of you have seen Eric answering questions that come in from behind the scenes during these webinars over the past few months. It's great to have all of them participating in the webinar this morning, and I'm looking forward to what they're bringing everyone today this morning. So as we get into the agenda for today's webinar, Andrew will be kicking things off with an introduction as he normally does. From there, Seth Peretta will be taking over to review the timeline of the COVID-19 relief legislation and take a look at the Phase 4 stimulus proposals that are out there. Then Seth is going to go over the COVID 4.0 legislative update and take us through a look at what the executive orders that were put in place by the president recently. At that point, we're going to invite Eric Fudum to say a few words and then help wrap things up as we go through a frequently asked questions regarding the loan forgiveness reporting process and the support available to you through Prestige PEO. As a reminder, I just want to let everybody know that you will be muted throughout the webinar. However, if you do have a question, I do urge you to use the Q&A feature within the webinar and direct the question to the panelists. We will do our best to answer all the questions that come in, and a copy of the presentation along with a recording of the webinar will be available in the COVID Resource Center of the Prestige website following this webinar. So at this point, I'd like to hand things over to Andy Lubash, who'd like to say a few words.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for attending our ongoing series of Wednesday WebExes. Hopefully, like I said, one day, we're not talking COVID and not talking stimulus. A lot happening. Obviously, we have the Democratic National Convention happening now. We have the Republican National Convention to follow it. A lot of what's happened up until now, and Seth will be talking about it in more detail, is again, Congress tried to pass a fourth stimulus package, basically at gridlock, both sides blaming each other, pointing at each other. Can't really tell you who's at fault other than the fact that nothing is necessarily being done. However, as Seth will discuss, is that President Trump signed 4 executive orders about a week and a half ago that will take effect on September 1st. That changes the landscape of the way we see things now. Again, kind of hoping that was really to nudge Congress to get back to the negotiating table, but that doesn't seem to have happened. Again, however, and I think Seth, last night, I don't know if he got it as well, there is a skinny piece of legislation flowing its way through Congress right now that may have some bipartisan support that, again, may be more in line with what can be agreed upon, that really just focuses on stimulus and the recovery as opposed to a number of different pet projects that a lot of politicians still we seem to have. But anyway, so as again, Seth is back, and I think anyone that's attended any of these webinars in the past can agree he really does know his stuff, and he's really plugged in, so we get an idea of what's happening, where we're going, just so we can prepare. Again, we're at Prestige. We're here to answer any questions you may have. Again, every week I put out my personal contact information, and I'm happy that people do reach out to me and ask questions. Again, I'll do that before I turn it over to Seth, and he goes, thank you for the kind words. But again, obviously my direct number is 917-258-0223. That will bypass the Prestige switchboard. My email address is alubash, A-L-U-B-A-S-H, @prestigepeo.com. And also, if you need me, my cell is 516-680-5021. So again, any questions, any advice, any criticism, anything we're doing well, I am here. I don't put this data out there for you guys not to use it. So again, with that, I will be quiet and put myself back on mute and turn it over to Seth. Andy, thank you for those kind words.
Andy.
Gotta keep you laughing a little. All right.
Andy, thank you for those kind words. No, happy to be back again today. Thank you for the kind introduction. On the next slide here, we're just going to give a quick sort of overview of where we are with respect to that legislation. So, this has been sort of several months in the making. We had basically some successful COVID legislation dating back to the end of March. The middle of March and then the end of March. We had the Families First Act enacted on March 10th. The CARES Act enacted on March 27th. There obviously was some thought by both Republicans and Democrats that some additional COVID relief legislation would be needed. On a prior call, we walked through the Democratic proposal for COVID relief legislation 4.0. That was the HEROES Act, which was passed on May 15th. The House and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solution Act. I think there are probably people who make their money just naming up pieces of legislation. The May 15th HEROES Act was a very significant piece of legislation that was really all-encompassing in terms of the relief that would be provided both to business as well as to state and local governments. Following the House-passed version of HEROES, the Republicans put out their version, the HEALS Act, which is the Health Economic Assistance Liability Protection in Schools Act. That was sort of released on July 27th, was not passed by the Democratic-controlled House, nor was it sort of introduced for passage in the Senate. So we had at this point sort of two competing pieces of federal legislation. You'll see there a big red dot. That's because that's where we are right now. There had been some hope that a compromise piece of legislation could have been arrived at prior to Congress going on summer recess. That did not happen. And that ultimately is what led to President Trump's issuance of 3 executive orders that we're going to talk about momentarily. But this next slide is something that you probably recall from my prior presentation, which is just intended to show you sort of economically how far apart the Democrats and the Republicans are in their stimulus proposals. So if you look here, the HEROES Act is $3 trillion, whereas Senate Republicans had proposed the HEALS Act at a price tag of $1 trillion. Before we had talked a little bit about the fact that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have a pretty difficult job here. You have, fiscal conservative budget hawks who are balking at the idea of spending even $1 trillion. On the other hand, you have the Democrats at $3 trillion, and you have state and local governments saying, we need funding. We are running out of money. Our tax base, because of the stay-at-home orders, because of the effects on our local economies, we need relief. In the HEROES Act, the state and local governmental relief was just shy of $1 trillion itself. So if you look at that, and then you think about the fact that Senate Republicans really wanted to keep it under a $1 trillion price tag, it becomes a really challenging environment for Senate and House Republicans to find a position that they can all agree upon, that they can then get agreement and buy-in from the Democrats. So really what happened following the Republican introduction of the HEALS Act was some degree of horse trading, but I think I think Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, they were not inclined to negotiate against themselves. And I think what they were thinking is, let's let the Republicans come to us. Ultimately, nothing came to pass. The folks did go out on recess. On the next slide here, we'll talk a little bit about sort of where we are. So as mentioned, Congress did delay the start of the August recess for about a week. When it became clear there was not going to be movement, basically Congress recessed. So that's where we are. House and Senate are not currently in session. Speaker Pelosi has indicated that she will call back members early. President Trump, who has not actually spoken to Speaker Pelosi in 10 months, has indicated he will meet with the Democrats at the right time. I think folks don't really know sort of what does that mean. There's a fair amount of pressure growing on the Senate and the House Democrats and Republicans to find a compromise. And part of that has been that there has been some mildly positive sort of economic news in the form of a lower number of new people applying for unemployment insurance benefits than previously. We've seen some new jobs being recreated, shall we say. So there's been some positive economic trend data that I think folks are becoming very nervous that unless we get a COVID 4.0, some of that positive movement may be stymied and may start to move backwards. In terms of timing, things are very unclear. While Pelosi has indicated she may call House members back early, the Senate has not indicated a similar position. Folks believe the parties are still very, very far away from any type of agreement. Internally at Groom, I think the thinking is maybe late September is when we see something potentially hashed out. But as you know, the supplemental unemployment insurance checks ran out at the end of July. Folks were hoping for a second bite at the apple on the PPP loans. State and local governments looking for their funding. So, the further we get away from sort of July 30th, potentially the more dire the economic situation becomes for the country, which may encourage those Senate and House Democrats and Republicans to come together. On the next slide here, this sort of looks very sort of snapshot look at implications for small business, right? As I mentioned, concerns that recent positive trends in unemployment insurance may reverse. That obviously is perhaps good news if you're looking for labor. On the other hand, what it really might signal is a general continuing weakening in the economy. And that would not be good if what you're seeking is to sort of restore your revenue numbers back to where they were on a pre-pandemic basis. There has obviously been some concern that the lack of the $600 per month unemployment insurance stipend, as well as the Democrats had proposed an additional taxpayer assistance stipend. I think the Republicans were on board with that as well. In the absence of those amounts continuing, there was some concern that this will cause a drop in spending and cause further economic pain. One of the other provisions in the House passed legislation and the Republican proposal was provisions that would effectively minimize the potential for Americans to face eviction as a result of non-payment of rent or mortgage. As we'll talk about, the president has sought to provide some relief there within the bounds of his existing authority, but those provisions, if they do not take effect through a compromised piece of legislation, we could see folks effectively being evicted or foreclosed upon, which would obviously be unfortunate and could have some additional downward effects on the economy as well. Lastly, but really importantly here, is cash-strapped state and local governments. There are a fair number of governments, both blue and red state governments, that really are facing some pretty significant fiscal challenges. And I think the hope is that compromise legislation will provide them some financial support. But as of right now, they're left wanting along with the rest of America. For small business who may have been hopeful that there would be bipartisan support of the ability to get another PPP loan, a chance to go back and get some more money that could be both used for payroll and business expenses, that could be forgivable. In the absence of compromise legislation, that is not available. And then there were a series of payroll tax credits in both pieces of legislation in the HEALS and the HEROES Act, whether it be PPP assistance, whether it be an expanded employee retention tax credit. Obviously, if those things are not available, that could implicate the overall financial position for the small business. So hopefully we will see something. I think when and if is the big question. I'm pretty optimistic we'll see something. I think realistically it'll be by the end of September, but in terms of actual specifics, it'll be, it's hard to predict. As our captain of prestige noted, there is a skinny bill version floating around here. And as Andy mentioned, it really does sort of cut down to the bare fundamentals for what the Republicans are looking for. It does include a liability shield, and that is something the Democrats have not been supportive of. Labor is very opposed to it. And so, you know, while the Republicans have sought to really sort of get down to brass tacks on what they would need to accept in terms of a compromise position, there are things in their must accept legislation that the Democrats are probably in the Democrats must not accept bucket. So as you can see, we really have a long way to go. All right, so moving on now, we're going to talk about what Trump did. So President Trump, you know, the art of the deal has been evasive for a host of reasons, including the fact, as evidenced by the bar graph, that both parties are just really far away from each other. So on August 8th, President Trump picked up his presidential pen and he issued 3 executive orders. The first one deals with a federal payroll tax deferral, and I'm really going to want to highlight the word deferral here. The reason I say that is because the president has, on repeated occasions, used the word payroll tax cut. And as we'll explain, it's not really a tax cut in the way that we think about tax cuts, because the taxes are ultimately owed unless Congress takes further action. So it's really the ability to defer the employee share of the OASDI payroll tax liability on wages from 9/1 to 12/31. We'll talk about that in a second. The second executive order deals with unemployment insurance benefits. You know, there was a lot of folks who were very happy to have that $600 per month supplemental unemployment insurance benefit. The states loved it because it was paid entirely by the federal government. That dried up in July. And so what President Trump did is use basically FEMA emergency disaster funds to provide some supplemental UI benefits. We'll talk about that as well. And then the third executive order, which we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about, but it's important nonetheless, is he's using his presidential authority to encourage his secretaries of his various agencies to use whatever authority they have to try to seek to minimize the potential for evictions and forfeitures. Really, what he's doing is effectively using the authority they have over recipients of HUD grants and HUD loans or fair housing loans to try to minimize the ability of those recipients to evict or foreclose on their renters or their buyers accordingly. All right, so now moving to the next slide here. This is the one that probably you should spend the most time thinking about, because it is the one where you're going to have some decisions to make as we come to September 1st of 2020. So what the executive order does is it directs the Secretary of Treasury, and this, I put it in quotes here because I think it's important to see the words, to defer the withholding, deposit, and payment of the employee's share of payroll taxes for what is called old age and survivor disability insurance. So that's really the Social Security piece of the payroll tax, from 9/1 through 12/31 of 2020. So we're talking about September, October, November, and December. You'll see there are a couple notes. One is it doesn't apply to the employee's share of Medicare taxes. So what we're really talking about is the 6.2% payroll tax related to Social Security. We're not talking about that additional 1.45% related to Medicare. The other thing is this just applies to the employee's share. What about the employer? Well, remember, the employer can already defer their share of payroll taxes pursuant to the CARES Act, right? And you can defer it. 50% has to be paid in 2021, 50% in 2022, but the employer already has the right to defer. So this executive order is really focused on the employee's ability to defer the Social Security portion of federal payroll taxes on wages from 9/1 through 12/31. It only applies, though, per the EO, to employees whose wages are generally $4,000, excuse me, I see a typo. It should be $4,000 or less during any bi-weekly payroll period. So that's really $8,000 per month, or 8,000 times 12 could be upwards of really $96,000 or $100,000 a year. So pretty far-reaching in terms of those employees that would be eligible for this deferral of payroll tax. Now, it doesn't go into a lot of detail about how you would apply that $4,000 threshold in the case of people who work hourly, people who get paid piecemeal or on commissions. What do you do about bonuses? I mean, tons and tons of questions around how that $4,000 threshold, biweekly threshold, would be applied in practice. And unfortunately, at this point, we have no idea, which is a little bit scary because September 1st is only less than 2 weeks away. So many questions to be answered by Treasury and IRS between now and September 1st. It directs the Secretary to, quote, pursue mechanisms to forgive any deferral. So, right, what this really means is that the employees, 6.2% of the employees' wages could be deferred, but they're not ultimately forgiven. It's not a holiday, it's not a tax cut, it's just a deferral. So what it really means is that for employees who had their 6.2% of their wages deferred, because it's really with respect to the employee tax liability, they will see their wages go up for September 1st through 12/31, potentially, maybe upwards of like $183 per biweekly pay period. But what happens though is they'll have to pay that money back, right? So then their ultimate payroll tax liability, say in Q1 of 2021, goes up, which has the effect of then reducing their actual take-home pay at some future point in time, because they're effectively having to make up for the deferral they would enjoy on the employee share of the Social Security tax from 9/1 through 12/31. Moving on down to the next slide. So there are many unanswered challenges and questions, right? One thing here is that the EO suggests employers may be able to choose whether to allow their employees to defer their share of OASDI taxes. So if you're an employer, and this is reflected in that fourth sub-bullet, you might be worried, what happens if your employee terminates employment before they've paid back their share of OASDI taxes? Does that become an employer liability? Does that liability follow the employee to the next employer? For many employers, the answer to that one question alone might be very important for them deciding whether they would take advantage of this opportunity to help increase the take-home pay of their employees from 9/1 through 12/31. Similarly, how does that $4,000 wage threshold apply? Employers would want to be able to know who's eligible for this. Also, as an employer, can I choose to make it available to some employees versus others, or to different work sites? Or, what is my flexibility in deciding which employees I may make available this opportunity to defer the payroll tax? And certainly as it comes to reporting on the 941 and beyond, a fair number of reporting questions remain unanswered. Some pretty significant trade groups here in DC, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Retail Federation, have come out and said that they expect that many of their employer members will not make available this payroll deferral opportunity for their employees because of the concerns around the potential liability in the event the employee is no longer around, as well as some of the thorny reporting issues. So, it is one of these things where the president issued the EO. It will be interesting to see how many employers choose to take advantage of it. As of right now, I think there's some pretty significant reasons why many employers might choose not to. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next EO. This is the unemployment insurance EO. As we talked about before, under the prior COVID legislation, the federal government made available an additional $600 per month stipend, and it was paid entirely by the federal government. States did not have to spend any money. So states loved it, people loved it. Some employers were not loving it because it made it hard to bring back workers to the extent those workers with that $600 UI supplement were effectively no worse off or even better off not working. So, there was obviously that argument, and that was something that the Republicans took into consideration when they issued the HEALS Act, because as you may recall, in the HEALS Act, the supplemental UI stipend was significantly less than the $600 that had been previously provided. Well, with no compromise in sight between the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, President Trump used his authority over the FEMA emergency funds to continue weekly UI payments. Now, originally, what was contemplated in the text of the EO was that individuals would receive a $400 supplemental stipend, $300 of which would come from FEMA funds, $100 of which would have to come from the states. So if the states did not want to fork over $100 or 25% of that $400 supplement, then none of the FEMA money would be made available, and really no one in that state would get any supplemental benefit. There were some states like South Dakota that came out in advance and said, we're not going to fork out that $100. Our state citizens don't need that money. People are getting back to work. We're not going to do it. There were other states that said, we really need it, but we can't afford it. Why can't we afford it? Because we have no money. And we were hoping to get some money, when COVID 4.0 legislation was passed, but it didn't get passed. So, gosh, we really want to make this available to our citizens, but we don't have the money. So under a revised approach, what the administration is doing is that any person that is receiving at least $100 a month in UI benefits from the state, and that means, so if under the normal state UI benefit formula, they're entitled to a state unemployment insurance benefit of $100 a month or more, they will be eligible to receive the additional $300 UI payment from the federal government. So effectively what it means is for most states, most states may have a baseline monthly UI benefit, say of $119, right? For states who are automatically at or above $100 per month based on their minimum UI benefit, well, then they're automatically going to not have to come out of pocket any additional money, and their citizens will be able to access that $300 UI payment. As of Monday, FEMA indicated that 6 states have been approved for the $300 supplement: Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, Louisiana. Sorry, that looks like Michigan. That is not Michigan. It's Missouri, excuse me, and Utah. So what happens when I didn't pay enough attention to doing my abbreviations on all my 50 states? Arizona actually started getting the money. Arizona, I believe, was the first state to begin getting that money already. So this is obviously good news, but for folks that have been hoping for the $600 stipend, that is not currently going to be available. It's going to be capped at $300. All right, moving to the next slide here. So the last EO, and the one that I think is important, but probably not as important to you all as small business owners, is the EO regarding evictions and forfeitures. So the first aspect, and this EO is somewhat more of a signaling. You'll see there from the first bullet, the first one is that he directed this HHS secretary, the director of CDC. And you're thinking, why is he directing the HHS secretary and the CDC director to do anything about evictions and forfeitures? Well, it's to consider whether any measures temporarily halting residential evictions of any tenants for failure to pay rent are reasonably necessary to prevent the further spread of COVID-19 from one state or possession into any other state or possession. So, they're really saying, like, would halting evictions help keep COVID from spreading? The second thing the EO directs is for the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to identify any and all available federal funds to provide temporary financial assistance to renters and homeowners who, as a result of the financial hardships caused by COVID, are struggling to meet their monthly rental and mortgage obligations. So they're saying, look around and see what federal funds are available to provide temporary financial assistance. At this point, it doesn't really amount, to material relief, but in theory, there may be amounts that have already been appropriated that are available to the Secretaries of Treasury or HUD to facilitate some temporary relief. But again, a little bit of a signaling message there as well. On the next slide, there's a little bit more sort of meat on the bones. He directs the Secretary of HUD to take action as appropriate and consistent with law to promote the ability of renters and homeowners to avoid eviction or foreclosure resulting from financial hardships caused by COVID. And then it goes on to say such action may include encouraging and providing assistance to public housing authorities, affordable housing owners, landlords, and recipients of federal grant funds in minimizing evictions and foreclosures. So effectively, for those entities that have received money from HUD or could receive money from HUD, using your authority over those funds to encourage those authorities to basically minimize their evictions and their foreclosures. And the last thing it does is it directs the Secretary of Treasury and the Director of FHFA to review all existing authorities and resources that may be used to prevent evictions and foreclosures. So, what there is in this 30-0 is a lot of go look and see what you can find. There's not a ton of specific dollars behind helping to prevent evictions and forfeitures. And where the administration will be most able to provide support is in connection with basically putting conditions of participation on the mortgages and the loans that they make available to housing authorities. As it relates to private commercial mortgage insurance, et cetera, maybe much harder to address through an EO than through congressional action. So those are the 3 EOs that we have today. Again, the payroll tax one is one that you really should be thinking about. I'm sure Prestige will be providing further guidance and support for you all as you work through that payroll tax piece. But with that, I will turn it back to our colleagues at Prestige.
Thank you, Seth, as always. Really appreciate you hopping on and talking about the legislative updates that you went through. So thank you as always. At this point right now, what I'd like to do is bring Eric Fudum, COO for Prestige PEO, into the loop here. Before we get into our frequently asked questions around the Paycheck Protection Program, loan forgiveness reports, and the process that we're going through, I know Eric wanted to say a few words.
Thank you, Jason. And it's always a thrill to follow up Seth Freda in his amazing presentation. So thank you, Seth, as usual, for the wonderful guidance that you bring to us and to our audience every week. I will say that I believe you have a run-in for Congress very soon, but we can talk offline about that. All right. So I also want to just give a big shout out to Jason. Jason Flynn brings it every week for our webinar series. The guy comes into our office, gets his temperature taken, gets ready, brings the pancakes. He brings pancakes for everyone every week, and then starts this webinar. So he's really done an amazing job, kind of bringing it every week. So thank you very much, Jason, for everything that you're doing for us. All right. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk a little FAQ. Now, normally, Carol Sawyer does the the PPP stuff, and she is the best. She is the face that runs the PPP place here at Prestige, and so I hope, Carol, if you're listening, I hope I can do half the job that you normally do, because you are the best. The FAQ section that we're going to talk about is some of its review. Some of these FAQs are based off of the PPP guidance that was released a couple of weeks ago, in August 4th, and then again on August 11th. So I wanted to touch upon some of those questions that were out there. I also wanted to just touch on some review that I think will better serve you. So on that note, Jason, let's get right to it.
Definitely. Great. Excellent. So first question we have here, Eric, is where do I find the most recent FAQs released by the SBA on August 11th?
Yeah, so that's going to be an important question, because a lot of what I talk about, as I stated, is based off those FAQs. And you literally, what I would do is just Google FAQs on PPP loan forgiveness. It'll pop right up. Click on the link. It goes to the SBA website, and you'll be able to download the 10 or 11 page document. There was a update on the FAQs on August 11th, and that includes just basic more information if you've taken out an EIDL loan or whatever the case is and how that works with it. So just Google that and you'll get right to it.
Great. Next question we have here on the slide is which loan forgiveness application should sole proprietors, independent contractors, or self-employed individuals with no employees complete?
So again, here we're trying to. The SBA is trying to make this very easy. This form 3508EZ is your go-to here. It's basically a one-page form with just basic information that you'll need to fill in, right, with the normal payroll data and all that, what that looks like. Page 2 is a certification page, which must be completed as well, but that is going to be your normal certifications that you make. So this form 3508, easy if you're in these situations, is going to be a big form for you to fill out, and hopefully won't take up too much time.
Great. Next question we have is, are payroll costs incurred during the covered period or alternative covered period, but paid after the covered period or alternative covered period eligible for loan forgiveness?
Yeah, so we only mentioned covered period like 5 times in that question. So the answer to the question, though, is yes, because, and this is a very common theme in all these rules that we go through. So as long as your payroll costs are paid before the next regular pay date, after the cover period is ended, then you're good to go, and we're going to include that in your payroll costs. Okay, so again, the theme is the SBA is wants to allow as much as possible within their rules and their construct, but anything that you're paying that might be after the cover period is basically going to be allowed, as long as you're not kind of taking too long and overlapping next payroll dates or next mortgage dates or whatever that looks like. So the answer is yes there.
All right. Moving over to the next slide here, we just have a couple questions on this slide. This first one asks, what about payroll costs incurred before the covered period but paid during the covered period?
Yeah, and on this one, you're good to go as well, because this is the other side of it. So what happens if you have payroll costs or rent or any of that kind of stuff that you've paid before the cover period started, but you cut the check during the cover period? You're good to go. They are eligible for forgiveness and include them. So these are, again, and I want to reiterate because it's important here. It's the common themes of they're kind of almost like a cash basis. Once you cut the check, you're pretty much good to go. So in this situation, so yeah, so you're good.
Great. This next question has definitely come up a lot as we've been trying to, work through these questions with clients around payroll. But the question specifically asks, are you required to calculate payroll costs for partial pay periods?
Yeah, and this one was addressed as well on the FAQs. So I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page on this one as well. So the answer to the question, though, really depends on your pay cycle. So if you're biweekly or more frequent, and in this case I use weekly, you have the option of using the 8-week period, the covered period for loans before June 5th, or the 24-week period on the first day. And in those cases, you're fine. You don't need to do anything partial because the rules are basically giving you an opportunity to align your covered period with your pay periods, right? And that's what that alternate payroll covered period does as well. It gives you, the covered period starts, you get your loan, and then you start your covered, your literally your payroll covered period when your next payroll starts. So that's good. That's pretty straightforward. I think when it gets a little more complicated is if you're less frequent. If you're semi-monthly or you're monthly, then you will be calculating costs for partial payrolls. So the good news is that the procedure report that we have designed, that we'll talk about in a second, will have those numbers for you. It's not like you're crunching the partial payroll costs. We got that, but it does become a little more complicated if you have a less frequent pay cycle.
All right, moving over to this next slide here, we have a couple questions. First one asks, for cash compensation, should we use gross pay or should we use net pay?
Yeah, you know what? It might be an easy answer. It might be but they addressed it. So I want to make sure it's stressed here. We're going to use gross amount for your payroll, for your cash compensation, for your payroll costs, right? And that includes all employee deductions up to the gross, right? So it is gross, and that will be, and we'll get to, in a few minutes, we'll talk about why that might be. So, Jason, we'll do the next one here.
Great. So generally, how does the loan forgiveness process work after I submit my loan forgiveness application to my lender?
Yeah, you know what? I wanted to go through this very high level just to make sure, everyone understands what's going to happen here once you've kind of submit your loan forgiveness application to your lender. Okay, the lender's going to review the application and confirm the data accuracy. Okay, so that's when you're going to also provide maybe payroll reports and any other data that the lender needs to then submit to the SBA for approval and loan reimbursement if necessary. Okay, so that there's going to be some timing here, right? So it's not going to happen in 2 seconds. There's going to be a time period here. So once the SBA approves that loan application from the lender, the SBA will in turn reimburse the lender for what they need to reimburse. Now, some of these applications will have an amount that's not entirely forgiven. So that will kind of accrue a loan that the borrower will need to pay back to the lender. Okay. So what will happen though is the SBA will reimburse the lender for the forgiveness amount, and then the lender will set up your loan terms as per what the PPP regulations are. So again, the reason why I just wanted to make sure we all understood this was because there's going to be a time period once you submit your loan forgiveness to get the actual either 100% approval on the loan forgiveness or potentially setting up your loan if you have one and you need to go forward with that process. So we will be monitoring this, every step of the way on this one. But I do just want to, caveat that there is right now, lenders really haven't been submitting anything because there's not the final guidance there, but so they might be accepting an application, but potentially, and I think Carol mentioned this last week, they might be holding on to it for now. So this is all going to probably weed itself out within the next, I would say, month or so, or 2 to 4 weeks, I would think. So that's what we're hearing. So on to the next one, Jason.
On to the next. So, and obviously loan forgiveness, the loan forgiveness process and the reports is something we've been speaking quite a bit about. It's something that we've been working on behind the scenes quite often here, and makes sense that these questions are relating to them. But this question brings out, when will the Prestige Loan Forgiveness Payroll Report be available? I know it's been a hot topic here as well.
Oh, it is. It's like your pancakes. It's a really hot topic. So clients will be able to submit their report request either to their HR business partner or their payroll specialist beginning on Tuesday, okay, August 25th. Now, we'll need to know some information so we can process the report correctly, okay? We need to know your loan date, basically when you received your loan. We need to know if you've used the 8-week period, before if you've received your loan before June 5th, or your 24-week covered period, okay? If 24 weeks, we do need to know the end date of the covered period. Again, our reports are going to be exact, right? They're going to cover that covered period. So we need to obviously know, the whole scope of it. And then if you're using the alternative payroll covered period, we're going to need to know that too, because that, again, gives us the timing, the time period of what your report should be, okay? So obviously for the alternative payroll cover period, we talked about this a little bit before, but no semi-monthly and monthly pay cycles are going to be used there. So the only other input I just want to let everyone know, if you are submitting your report request, we are expecting a huge amount of traffic, I guess starting Tuesday. And, so we're going to get to your report as soon as possible. Right now, we have a 24-hour turnaround time. Now, that's just the worst case scenario. We will get those to you as soon as we can. So, and I do, feel that as our clients get their reports faster, they will have the ability to, that time period will be hours, maybe even minutes. So, well, the other part of it is we're going to run this report for you. We're going to be more consultative on it, so you have the right information. So it's not a report that you can be able to run online, and we'll go from there. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now. We're Tuesday, you'll be able to submit it, and then we'll go from there. We just need to have this information. I know we spoke about this last week, but we would ask that all your kind of ownership information and all that kind of stuff is accurate in our Prestige Pro system. So, there won't be issues there in terms of calculating owner pay or doing any of that kind of stuff. So that's where we're at right now. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, because I know this is going to be, a hot topic going forward. So that's where we're at right now.
All right. So, and I believe we have our last question on this slide, our last frequently asked question, asks, will a borrower be subject to a reduction in forgiveness due to a reduction in FTE, full-time equivalent employees, but the employer offered to rehire the employee, but the employee declined?
Yeah, this is a popular one, and again, they addressed it. They addressed it on the early August FAQs because they wanted to make sure that there was no, confusion. But there is a role here for the employer to do. So the answer is going to be, most likely no. There's not a reduction in forgiveness, but the SBA is asking for documentation. So they want the borrower to document the inability to rehire employees if there are employees on 2/15 or February 15th to 20, and the inability to hire similarly qualified individuals before the end of the year, 12/31. Okay. They're also asking for borrowers to inform your state unemployment office that this person has declined employment, and most likely to so if that employee files a claim, they won't be eligible for unemployment. Okay, that kind of makes sense if you remember. And then finally, they want you to maintain written documentation of your job offer. If the employee responds to you with a rejection on an email or whatever, please save that. And then, written records of efforts to hire a similarly qualified individual. So, look, the answer is, the good news is, you're not going to be you potentially are not subject to a reduction in forgiveness, but you do got to kind of earn it a little bit. So, so that's kind of what we're looking at right now in that question. So it keeps on coming up. So I'm glad we're addressing it now, and I'm sure, the SBA will continue to address it as well. So.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that from an HR perspective here, I will say that your HR business partners, this client services department, we do have a process for reporting employees that were offered to return to work that were on unemployment and refused to. And we just ask that if you do run into those situations where you offer to have an employer return to their position, return to work, and they refuse that return to work, please notify your HR business partner so that we can go through the process of notifying the state and reporting that to them. And definitely work with your HRBP, and we'll take care of that process for you.
Great. Yep. And now this is a little extra credit here. I wanted to add a couple of just terms that you're going to see a lot. If you haven't already, this is kind of a review, but it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page. 25% wage reduction. Okay. So again, you lose your loan forgiveness, for wage or salary reductions over 25%, not 25%. So if it's 20% or 15%, you should be pretty good there. That there's no loan forgiveness. Again, they're trying to make sure that there's no steep, wage salary reductions. Even though you're not letting employees go. So it's the amount over the 25% that would be the loan forgiveness amount. All right. So the next, we've talked about this at length. You've heard it. The alternative covered period. Again, after you receive your loan proceeds, it's that first day of your next pay period that will start your covered period, right, for payroll, right? So this is going to apply for more biweekly or more frequent pay cycles, okay? So just beware, if you have any questions on what that will look like, ask the question to us, but that's what means here, alternative, that's what that means. Now, the next two, I wanted to talk about benefit costs, retirement costs. These costs that we're going to include are employer paid. They're not employee paid. Okay. Remember we talked about gross payroll before. That's part of cash compensation, which includes employee basically paid deductions, pre-tax, whatever that looks like. Well, that's why, right? So we're not going to let you double dip, right? The SBA is not going to let you double dip. So that's why the benefit costs, the retirement costs are going to be employer paid costs that you'll see included. Okay. We talked about this one. Again, I want to make sure we understand that 3508EZ. That is the easier loan forgiveness form to use, okay? But under certain scenarios, there's going to be three. If you look at that form, you'll see that there's a checklist to that form as well. There's 3 boxes to it, and basically, you have to, if you check one of those boxes, it's pretty straightforward. But if you do, then you potentially want to use this form to fill it out. The other form, as we know, is very complex. And it's just a lot more work and documentation that you need to kind of use. And then the 8-week cover period, which we've talked about as well. Those are loans received before June 5th. So if you receive your loan before June 5th, you have potentially the 8-week option here to use. Otherwise, it's 24 weeks. And then now this one is the big one. That there's the FAQs in early August. They kind of put it in about a page and a half, maybe even more, of how what cash compensation of owners and self-employed individuals are eligible, right? So unfortunately, I can't go through all of that right now. If you have any questions, please contact. But I just wanted to make sure that you understood that there's a cap on this stuff. The cap is $15,385 for 8-week cover period and $20,833 for 24-week cover period for owners, self-individuals. Like I said before, just review the FAQs specifically because they do address S corps, C corps, self-employed, and general partners. Okay. Now, before I finish up, I do have my Q&As up here right now. So we received a few questions expectedly on the loan forgiveness for Prestige. We won't be able to produce a report. One of the questions is, can Prestige submit a report for a 24-week period before the 24-week period is finished? The answer is no, but we will be able to provide, screenshots of what the report would look like. Okay, so there are just certain, parameters we need to make sure we capture the right information, right? And again, as we spoke about before, if it's a partial pay period, if you're semi-monthly or monthly, it even makes it a little more complex. So we need to know when that cover period is in to have your full report. For those of you who have been receiving the Forgiveness Bureau reports weekly or every payroll, that is still you can still run those. I think the loan forgiveness report that we're talking about here is basically when your cover period is over and you're able to have your full data that you need to complete your loan forgiveness application. So a little bit of a difference, but we can do both. We'll be able to run both. So those are the 2 questions I wanted to address here. There are a couple others that I will address offline, but it is a complex road here. We are doing our best to get all this information to you as fast as possible, and we will continue to do so. The next challenge we have is going to be if these executive orders become reality and this whole FICA Social Security deferral is in place. We're still coming up with our parameters. I'm going to need to want to contact you and communicate with you how we want to approach this, right? And you might say, hey, I don't want to do this, right? I don't want our employees to have the FICA Social Security deferral. So it's a give and a take, and there's a lot of moving parts to this. And of course, it's August 19th, and we don't have this guidance. So we're working hard. We with our partners, Seth Peretta and Malcolm, Bloom Law Group and our partners in Washington with Andy's, kind of cooperation as our NAPIO chair. We're getting information up to speed and as soon as possible. This will be communicated to you in our weekly communications, as well as in our weekly webinars. So this is it doesn't get much more complex out of this for the next 4.5 months of the year. So 2020 is ready to be done in our eyes, but we have a lot of work to do for you, our clients, our community. So I will end it there. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to discuss some of the FAQs here of the PPP and just kind of where we are at with a lot of the stuff that we're doing. So, Jason, I will turn it back to you. And again, everyone have a wonderful day and a great rest of the summer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Eric, and thank you for the kind words earlier. It definitely takes a village here to bring these webinars to everyone on these calls week in and week out. So while I enjoy my piece of the puzzle here, there's a lot more praise to go around from behind the scenes, not just with Prestige employees, but also our partners, our very trusted partners that we bring to you each week, as well as our participants on these webinars. You, the clients, you bring a lot of these questions to us that I know for sure help out a lot of other clients. So we're all in this together, and there's a lot of appreciation to go around, and we'll continue doing it. We'll continue bringing everything out to our clients as the information comes out to us, and the webinars will push on. So I do want to remind everybody that our client communications are being worked on all week long, and that should go out to everybody very soon, towards the end of the week or during the beginning of the week. And I also urge everyone to take a look on our website during the COVID or in the COVID-19 Resource Center, where we have a wealth of information that's constantly updated for you. Thank you again for everyone spending some time of your Wednesday morning with us. If you do have any questions, please reach out to us separately. We'll get to all your questions that you brought through on the chat. And we look forward to speaking with everyone again next Wednesday. Have a great week. Talk to you soon.